all day long you've been thinking and talking and learning about this issue of democracy, press freedom, and particularly the upcoming election. Chris Dornan, he is an associate professor of journalism. He was actually here when I was here as a student. He's going to be writing a white paper for the Canadian Commission for UNESCO on behalf of World Press Freedom Committee. So whatever you put into this document here will actually help him. If you have thoughts, if you think there are takeaways from today, ideas, put them into this doc and they'll get him thinking too, and hopefully he won't take all the credit for it, and you guys can contribute and share some of your learning. So there's 3 questions there. What will you do differently for the 2019 campaign? What will you consider, 2 questions, sorry. What will you consider as you read and share political news? That or anything else that you heard today that you think might help Chris Dornan as he starts to tackle that. Let's turn now to these lovely people. Some I know better than others. We've gathered them really to talk a little bit, and you can use me a little bit too if you want, to talk about how the campaign is going to be covered inside different newsrooms, whether it be traditional media or what we would typically call sort of startups or new sort of media organizations. They will give us some advice in terms of what they're going to do, but also maybe just some advice for you as we approach the election, things that you should also keep in mind. So let's start with Susan Delacourt. She's an Ottawa columnist and the bureau chief for the Toronto Star. She's been covering politics, I don't know, should I admit that for you? On Parliament Hill since the 1980s. She's written 4 political books. They are all excellent, but her latest, Shopping for Votes, is so helpful if you're trying to understand what politicians are doing and how much information is behind what they're doing. It was a finalist for the 2014 Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize. And she's regularly on CBC Radio, CBC, CTV. She's taught journalism and political communications here at Carleton. So a wealth of information. Mike D'Souza is from the National Observer, the managing editor. I first met Mike in Quebec City. We were both newbies at the National Assembly there. But he's now really moved into, for the past decade or so, a focus on energy and environmental policies inside government industry. It's one of the really good ways to make a career for yourself is become an expert on something. That's what Mike has done. In 2017, he won the Canadian Association of Journalists Award for his investigation into the conflict of interest in the federal review on the Energy East pipeline. And it was killed after that, so that was Mike. Mike's from Montreal, and as I said, he started he was at the National Assembly. He's also worked on Parliament Hill in Calgary and other places. Murad Hamadi, who we apparently have been in the same room but never spoken, so this will be our chance to get to know each other. He's based here in Ottawa, covers business and innovation policies, scale-ups, and lentil stories, I'm told.
Pulses are very important.
Microphone, Murad, microphone.
Pulses are very important to Canada. People don't realize
Yes,
this.
they are. I also like lentils. He works for The Logic, which is, how long has it been around now?
We're coming up on a year in June.
And before that, he covered politics and wrote a daily newsletter for Maclean's. Again, different sort of perspectives that you can bring for us. Michelle Richardson is with the Ottawa Citizen. She's the editor-in-chief of the Ottawa Citizen and Ottawa Sun newsroom, a position she's had since 2016, the first woman to lead the Ottawa Citizen in its history. Formerly the managing editor and city editor at the Montreal Gazette, where she worked for 12 years. And Lindsay Sample. Sorry, I haven't met you before either, so hello. She's from The Discourse, the managing editor of The Discourse, but she used to be at CBC's Marketplace. Oh, I didn't know you. And as it happens, and lots of other places, The Discourse is an award-winning digital news media company that brings together journalists, community members, partners to bring in-depth journalism inside communities that are typically underserved by more traditional media. Okay, so that's who these people are. I'll do some questions, and then you guys can come up and ask some questions. But let's just start with how you're all feeling about the upcoming election, and sort of, given what we've been talking about today, some of the new obstacles that are out there, because every election that I've covered has certainly been different, because there's always new platforms, new social media, new threats, and the kinds of things that you're thinking about heading into it. Why don't I start with you, Michelle?
So the key thing for me personally, and I'm very much speaking on my behalf and not necessarily the newsroom, but I really think that my role heading into the election is one of closing that trust gap. And it's something that we heard a lot about this morning, just about this kind of doubts about traditional media. And those doubts allow people, I think, to kind of get in there and craft this fake news narrative. So one of my key things is focusing on growing media literacy, not just among our readers and our audience, but kind of just a wider circle of community stakeholders.
Yeah.
So I think that there are a few key ingredients, and those are the ingredients I'm focusing on, are transparency, making sure we're operating in a very transparent way, so that people, that when we do make mistakes, we're owning up to it, we're being transparent about it. We're not perfect, things happen. That we're explaining the work that we do so people understand the process that goes into it. So, when we use somebody who's not named in a story, we're explaining why that person's not named so that nobody can come back and say, well, this is a fabricated person, a fabricated quote. Those kinds of things I think are really key. The second thing that I would really be focusing on, and we've started doing that already, and we're going to keep doing it throughout the coming months, but is really bringing our audience into the work that we do. So on big files where we've invested a lot of resources, not necessarily the files that are going to be getting the most traffic, but the ones that we think are really important, showing readers the work that has gone into making them happen. So speaking with the reporters about the number of hours, the number of people they spoke to on all sides, bringing people into that so they understand the critical process that we go through, that this isn't something we take lightly, this isn't something that we just kind of poof create, but have put thought into it, and that there's a rigorous process behind it. And the last thing that I've been focusing on, and I think that the part that keeps me awake at night and the part that really stresses me out, is trying to have a bigger dialogue with stakeholders in the community, within my personal life, but in the wider community, to try and have a meaningful dialogue to correct some of that misinformation out there in a way that will actually have an impact, as opposed to preaching like, actually that's fake. It conforms to a lot of people's worldviews when they share something that is fake, and so trying to let them understand that that information might align with what they see, but it's not actually rooted in fact, and do it in a way that when they look to other news, that they're consuming it in a more critical way.
A lot of that is I agree with all of it. A lot of it is stuff I think that the CBC has done more of probably over the past decade. That sort of lifting of the curtain. This is how we got this story. This is sort of who we talked to. This is why we did it. It might be more challenging in media organizations that are newer, right? I don't know if you would agree with that, but if you don't have the same brand and trust recognition, I just wonder how you go about then reassuring people that you have done the work, that they can have confidence in you. Do you want to tackle that? And then I see Susan wants in.
I mean, yes and no. People don't know who you are. I have a lot of cards, by the way. We can fix that.
Well, people know who you are, but they might not know the logic. To
be serious about it, we also don't have any baggage. Now, the baggage is, I think it's often unfair, but legacy media outlets often have a perceived slant, a perceived association, a perceived ideology. Often, if you talk to the people in those newsrooms, there's no such thing, I'd say most of the time. But we don't have that. We're brand new. So you get to project whatever you want onto us. And one of the ways that we deal with that kind of thing on a day-to-day basis is picking our spots. We're a fairly niche outlet. We serve a general audience, but we cover innovation, we cover business. I think we'll get more into this later, but I think there's become this thing, simple things like fact-checking, the work that Danielle Dale does in Washington, have become partisan things. Like fact-checking a politician has become a partisan thing. How dare you question the basis of our facts?
Right.
And we should not always be reacting to the loudest voices who claim we're partisan, but at the same time, picking what matters, picking what's worth fact-checking, I think matters as much as doing the thing itself. And to come back to the new outlets, when we're creating our impression, when we're creating what people see of us, that's a little bit of how you do it. Pick your spots. If you're going to tell us this is terrible, it has to have consequence, and that's why we're telling you it's
Right.
terrible.
Good points. Susan, just from a more traditional, I am too, not old, we're not old, but we're old school. What do you think of sort of how that helps or hinders you as we head into an election?
It's Michelle talked about what keeps her up at night.
I think it's on. Put it close. There you
What
go.
keeps her up at night? What's been troubling me, not just with the coming one, but with the past one too, is I think about 20 years ago was the last time that media outlets knew as much about the audience or the voters as the political parties. That there has been this huge gap, and we're not talking to the electorate on the same channel that the political parties are. They're using all kinds of other ways to talk to them. They have data that they're keeping private. We can't get at that. And I think there's a real tug of war there's two tugs of war I think that I'm worried about. One is between the traditional way of covering an election on the leaders' buses or planes, and I almost think that's irrelevant now. That's my colleagues will not be pleased to hear me say that, but I don't know how much a journalist gets out of being on a plane with a leader. And also, we cover platforms and not the advertising. That we pay so much attention to the launch of a campaign platform. Most Canadians do not see the platforms. They do see the ads. So I actually think the last week or 8 have been kind of instructive, but especially budget week, in this exact tension, which was what we should have been covering was the budget. We should have been covering what actually means things to people, but we are all tied up in this incredible story that has still more gaps in it than has facts, that has polarized people. It polarizes dinner parties. That is a microcosm of what the election could be, I think, at the worst, is that a whole bunch of stuff will be happening, like a budget, of relevance to Canadians, and we'll all be off chasing this thing that's making people argue at dinner tables.
Yeah, because so often elections, and I think that's what we're seeing now, are just about leadership, and that's what that story comes down to. You know what story we're talking about. So sometimes you get caught up not explaining the other things, and it has been remarkable. I can't remember. You might be able to. I can't remember a budget that has lasted, for that amount of time. And it was a budget. It wasn't a bad budget. Like, there were things in it that were meaningful for people. Mike, how about you? The things that you guys are thinking about, because you too, I don't know if alternative is the right, but not traditional, I think is fair to say.
Well, new media, I would say.
Yeah, new media, good, okay.
Like, I think, Michelle touched on a point,
Yeah.
about the dialogue, which is something that has been in our business model. Dialogue with our audience is important to be able to build, to be able to get new subscribers. So we have gotten accustomed not only to doing in-depth deep dives, but also taking the time to explain to our readers how we got the story and making sure they understand the work that we're doing that goes into this coverage. So, this is something that I think heading into the next election or just in terms of surviving and building and growing journalism, we have to listen to readers and be prepared to hear how they perceive, how they interpret the news, the issues that they're concerned about, and we're constantly listening and trying to build trust by hearing. And it doesn't mean that we are going to be doing what is popular or deciding to focus on issues just because it gets a lot of traffic, but it just means taking the time to listen when someone is upset about something or someone is happy about something, that we can adjust our coverage accordingly to make sure that we're striking all the right chords or notes to tell them the story in a format that they understand and that is useful to them and that serves them as the public servants that journalists are.
And Lindsay, if you are, your group, your organization is trying to get to the people that don't feel represented. Is that fair to say that's sort of your goal, to make sure people are heard?
Well, so what the discourse is focused on is in-depth journalism in underserved communities. So right now we have 3 reporters, one in Scarborough, one in the Cowichan Valley, and one in the urban Indigenous community, as well as a group of data journalists and reporters. And so what we're saying is, if national news, especially when you think about an election cycle and how many news outlets have shut down across the country, if national news is only coming from the downtown cores of urban centers, what does that say about what we know about our country? And if these smaller communities only have daily news but not in-depth news, then there's a really big piece missing. So that's the gap that we're trying to fill.
And how does that influence then the way you cover an election, where the threat of fake news, people not believing you, all that kind of stuff, it's present for you as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And we think as well about community engagement and genuinely listening to people about what issues matter to them. Because also when we look at an election and the number of people that turn out to vote, it's not that high, right? Unfortunately. And so if we're thinking about how our communities will be after that election, what we're really, really interested in narrowing in on is polarization and hate. Because the last data, 2017 police reported StatsCan data, 47% increase in hate crimes against Muslim, Black, and Jewish people. We know that there's racism fueling hate against Indigenous communities across Canada. So where will that be left after this election? And that's where we're targeting our work.
And how do you all sort of deal with the people that feel they're not being heard? Because that's sort of part of building trust, right? I think, as you alluded to, there are people that look at, well, I'm going to watch CBC and that's all I watch or whatever. But I was recently out in Alberta, for instance, and there was a real sense of people were thrilled to see the CBC there, just because they just wanted to make sure that their issues were on our radar. So I just wonder how much of making sure that people feel part of that conversation helps shore up the journalism and the trust in journalism. Any thoughts on that, anyone? Susan?
Some of this isn't new. I hope I wasn't rolling my eyes there, because there has always been, not at your question, of course.
No, of course not.
No.
Never.
No, it's the idea that the media is not telling the public what it wants to hear.
That's right.
And I, again, because I'm a fossil, I dealt with I covered the constitutional debates in the country. And we kept getting, in those days we didn't have Twitter or Facebook to tell us what idiots we were. We only heard it, letters. And people kept saying, I don't know what's in this complicated constitution. So we would, I saw Hugh, it was his phrase, I think.
Down there.
Yes, we would fell forests, right? To put out special editions of the paper with every aspect of the constitutional coverage. And it didn't change people's perceptions an iota that we were not covering things. So in many ways, this is just a new version of an old thing. And I don't want to be dismissive of it. And we were talking earlier, I think there was, somebody had said earlier that we don't pay attention to data in our day-to-day stuff. I do. I read what people are reading in the Toronto Star. I read it a lot. I'm heartened by it. I think what people like to read is explainers. You'd be surprised how many people love to read about carbon tax. I'm not kidding, it is huge. So I think the thing is, the same challenge we've had since I first got to Ottawa is tell people stories and don't speak down to them. I think people actually understand when they're being spoken down to, and that's what ticks them off more than anything else.
Michelle, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think it's one of the things that we've tried to do is tell the same, so to your point about the format, tell the same story or give people the same information in different ways. So using, videos or then, a very traditional kind of narrative print story, just because we are finding that some people are feeling shut out and we're saying, but no, we've given you this information and it's right here, but that's not how they're seeking it out. So even, through social media posting, trying to think of that as a more accessible way for people to digest information. But it is something that we grapple with because we think we're doing a good job of reflecting what's happening. And then we hear from people that, in fact, they feel left out of the conversation.
What about sort of what Fergus was talking about and what you were talking about earlier? I think the first iteration of it, maybe 2 election cycles ago, we saw parties just going directly to voters, right? Just shutting us out altogether. There was some concern around the media. Well, what do we do? And that has only become more and more sophisticated, whether it be the use of WhatsApp, Andrew Scheer sending texts about the carbon tax going into effect tomorrow, these different ways of just getting directly to people. How do you approach that in the next election, knowing that that is more sophisticated on more social media platforms, and people can choose not to go near your information at all and just take it directly from the source, whether it's right or not, right?
Well, we haven't lived in a 3-network world in decades. In some ways, like this fragmentation is. I think sometimes we get sort of befuddled by the medium side of this. Like, to give you an example, when and shamefully, it was so many news cycles ago, I cannot remember her name. The Liberal candidate in Burnaby South.
Yes.
When that story happened, there was to me a surprising amount of focus on the fact that the message came out was on WeChat. So this message, in which, if for the 5 people in the room who did not see that news cycle, this Liberal candidate running against Jagmeet Singh sent out a message essentially emphasizing her Chinese Canadian, or I guess specifically her Chinese background and his Indian background.
And WeChat is a Chinese WhatsApp, essentially.
Yeah, that is a platform that does a lot more than messaging in China and here, increasingly so. But it was like this fascinating, strange thing. Like, it's WeChat. Yeah, but it's like Facebook Messenger, right? Like, you send stuff to people on Facebook Messenger, and I think sometimes we get really distracted by the fact that this message is being spread in ways that we can't see. But it's like moving back to the living room conversation, knocking on doors thing. Like, unless you've got a person following every candidate all the time, you don't know what they're saying. Sure, I'm not trying to downplay the size difference in these mediums, but I think sometimes we just and as you can see, I'm a hand talker, this mic is helping. It's like waving our hands over WeChat or WhatsApp, and we have this conversation about platform liability. Like, that's part of what I do, is look at policy on that side, and those are important conversations to have. These platforms are mediating the conversation. But I mean, I grew up in India. Like, there's an Indian election coming up, and I'm terrified because of the way WhatsApp is being used, not because WhatsApp is what's being used. If that distinction makes sense. I think we need to pay attention to those things. Like, to butcher McLuhan, the message here matters. I don't really care about the medium so much.
Yeah.
Well, and then that is a really good example, because the medium didn't really matter because she got caught out for whatever, saying things that weren't the right things to say, and she had to quit. So, Mike, any thoughts on that, on how whether it's something that you think about more in this election, the fact that people will be going, maybe not choosing to read us as much, or?
Well, I mean, I think there's always ways that, and because I'm on the managing side as well, I'm looking at the different things that we're doing to reach larger audiences. So media outlets can target different groups in the same way that political parties could if they wanted to. And even this explanation about, they're going to target us directly, they don't need us, they do. Last weekend, I think, at the Manning conference, Doug Ford was saying, we can go straight to social media. 2 days before that, the Office of the Energy Minister had emailed us asking us to take down a story that was related to what they were doing on climate policy and cuts to conservation programs. So if they really don't need us, and if they really don't care, and the funny thing, this was behind our hard paywall as well. So they were actually telling us, for a story that people had to pay to access, they wanted us to take that down. So
and I'm sure you complied immediately. No.
We actually responded by asking, well, they said that the story had false information. They referred us to a report, and then we looked at the report and found that it actually backed up what our report said. So we asked them additional questions, and
I'm afraid we have to insist.
and they haven't responded to our additional
yeah,
questions
okay
yet.
then.
So
Good anecdote. Lindsay, is that something that you, or is it, or because you're trying to get to people that don't have access or don't feel, that they are represented, is that something that you struggle with?
I think what Mike said makes sense. I mean, yes, we serve specific communities through our journalism, but we also do a lot of national data-driven investigations. So I think a lot of us are grappling with the same things. But to this point about we need each other, I think there's also a tendency in the media to say, okay, there are these startups, there's the new guys, there's all of us need each other in that same way. And you look at the stories that the Discourse has published or the Logic has published, and or not like all of us have published, and you see how that trickles through different news cycles and can lead the stories. So I think that the reality that anything is isolated in that way doesn't really make sense to me because, the internet, pretty much. And I think what we will see, I know what we'll see in this election is a lot more collaborations happening across journalism outlets too. So it's just going to be a different landscape, I think.
I want you to start thinking, if you have a question, come up and get in line. I'm going to ask one more. So these are all really smart, different perspectives. So please come up and ask some questions. Without revealing too much of our election plan, which is, I don't know, sort of half-assed done. I do know that we have, we will have a focus on people trying to find the fake stories, the bots, that will be something that the interference that I talked about that we've already seen from a couple of Russian type agents that we expect to see more of. Are there other newsrooms in that you're all going to sort of get involved in that to some capacity?
We are.
Yeah.
We've already started with BuzzFeed. The Star and BuzzFeed are working together. There was a story this week on and monitoring and doing all that. Mike and I were at a presentation this week by Facebook. Actually, I was interviewing. And I had not really appreciated this until I was talking to him. There's a new legislation coming in, Bill C-76, that tightens up controls over how social media is going to be used in the election campaign and advertising in particular. And Facebook will have an ad library. So you will be able to go to this ad library and it will keep ads on there. Anybody who wants to put an ad on Facebook has to register. And then it will be documented. And journalists like me will be able to search that library, and it's used by third parties.
Sounds like a shopping for votes too, Susan.
No, never again. But it is, I do think we'll use tools like that to be able to track what people are doing in a way that we weren't able to before.
That's interesting. The fraud though, or the people trying to influence results, is that something people are talking? Yeah, you're talking about your newsroom.
We're hiring a reporter to look at misinformation. We're doing interviews right now. Hopefully, we'll have that reporter in place within a week or so. Who's going to focus exclusively on misinformation, like a wide swath of issues ranging from bots, foreign influence, the far right. So we'll look at all of these issues, including as well as misinformation that could come from the corporate sector on issues like climate change or the issue of anti-vaxxers and so on. But we've decided that this should be a focus that we need to cover more and that readers need.
I would imagine that's something you're going to do at the Logic too, just because you're more into innovation and technology. Is it something you'd look at?
We're not so much focused on the actual fake news side of it or the misinformation, like the stuff at the end that people see. I think we're more interested in this from a policy perspective. So Susan mentioned Bill C-76. Facebook has this library that they're creating. Google won't, because Google has decided it's just not going to allow ads. Twitter has been playing fast, a little loose with saying exactly what they're going to do.
And the government had just been saying to them, please to do it.
Please
Yeah.
do it,
Yeah.
please do it. The government's stance seems to be, we really think you should do something about this, and we're really quite upset that you haven't. And that's been about 6 months now. But but what I will say is that we have been fascinated for a while by how the government has come around to seeing this as a real issue.
As an issue that needs to be regulated.
As an issue that needs to
Yeah.
be regulated, that needs to be talked about. It's interesting in Australia, they're talking about laws, takedown laws, like really harsh takedown laws
Yeah.
that include jail time for executives whose companies don't comply. Now, the fact that they're doing this only in the wake of that horrific video in New Zealand tells you everything you need to know about how governments are reacting to this
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
It is crisis
Reaction.
policy.
Yeah.
One thing that I will say, though, and this applies to an audience that includes people in the academic world for now, we don't have enough people studying tech
Totally.
policy and regulation
Totally.
in Canada. We
Yeah.
just don't.
Yeah.
There are 4 or 5 people who I can call when I'm writing a story about this, and that's it. That's a serious problem.
I'm just going to call you from now on. either of your newsrooms doing any, like, an awareness of it, tackling it, a plan? Lindsay, and then Michelle?
Yeah, we're doing a big collaborative journalism project for the election where we'll be bringing people together to co-design an election project specifically focused around misinformation and hate, and looking at less at we'll be collaborating with the folks that are doing kind of the stamp approach,
Yeah.
the true, false, that
Yeah,
kind of thing,
yeah.
but more looking at in-depth on specific issues that are impacting communities.
Consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah. Michelle?
Certainly, it's been kind of what we decided was going to be a main focus from the get-go for local election coverage, and it was something that we've been talking about, for months and months, because it is a huge issue, and not, on a very big scale nationally, but also on a local scale with, down to the neighborhood level of the information, disinformation that's out there. So.
And it's hard because it's not something, I mean, Mike said they're hiring a specific journalist to do it. It's not something you are naturally trained. I mean, you're trained to know what's real and what's not, but you're not necessarily trained in the technology part behind it, right? How to identify where it's coming from, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the tracking part of it, the
Yes.
forensics of it, I
That's
think
right.
are way more complex than I had realized when we first started
sure,
kind of
for
trying to follow that thread.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So if you're a journalism student, there's another beat you could take. We need more of you. A question.
Yep.
Just say who you are and.
My name's Christian Poslang. I'm a Master's of Journalism student here. I was wondering, it's a slightly more of a general question, but I think in this election, we're probably going to see the greatest potential for the discovery of potentially controversial statements or actions in the past of candidates on their social media. As more and more people have their entire lives online, and as we know that the tendency of social media is to pile on things, what role do media play, or can they play, in terms of determining what's worthy of coverage, what's worthy of airing?
I don't know that it's going to be worse than the last election. Do you remember the pea in the cup?
I remember, but I think we're already seeing a lot
Yes.
in Alberta,
Yes,
right? And
yes, in
so
Alberta, yes,
I think
yes.
there's more people online, younger candidates that have spent all their lives,
Yes.
or the majority of the adults' lives on Facebook. or
Yeah,
on
which
Twitter.
is why you should just be very careful if you're a young person.
pee in a
Yeah,
cup.
don't pee in a cup, and don't there was a woman in the last election who didn't know what Auschwitz was. Do you remember her?
Right.
Yeah, and took fan pictures.
But the
and
question
that was
is-
the end of her.
the
So
question
you think it's going to be? The question is, will it be worse, and how do we deal with it?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Will it be? I assume it will be worse.
Yeah.
That there will just be more things. But
Yeah.
whether our standards should be higher or lower, based on the fact that there's just, everyone has
just
embarrassing
allow
things
for
in their
mistake.
past. Well,
Okay.
maybe.
Okay.
I'm
That's a good-
asking what you think.
Yes. So that's a good one. Should we, because everybody lives on social media and is stupid, should we lower the bar of those candidates and say, oh, well, you did that in 1991. You couldn't have known you were going to be a candidate. That's okay. It's a good question.
I would say that no matter what we're choosing to cover or not to cover is a judgment call. And so if something is really egregious that somebody's posted on social media, to me, it's no different than if somebody made an egregious statement publicly at a forum like this. And so it's the same kind of value judgment. So if something is newsworthy, I definitely think it's something we would cover. But just because somebody comes out with, digs something up that somebody said when they were 21, if there's no news value in it, I don't think that
Yeah.
that's that doesn't change just because it's happening now and just because we have the ability to kind of have this time capsule of
Sure.
dumb things that were said,
Yeah,
right?
Susan.
Yeah, often I think we're skipping a step in there because what happened in a lot of those cases last election was the parties were blamed for not vetting them properly. I think all parties were horrified by what happened in the last campaign, and I would imagine like some of that is going to stop there. They've got way more sophisticated about looking that stuff up. And I would just also point out to the news value, Donald Trump is president of the United States, right? So it's proof that sometimes what horrifies us isn't really an obstacle to getting elected.
Although I would have you look at the Me Too movement, right, where we've seen behavior from 20, 30 years ago that was quote unquote acceptable at the time, no longer being tolerated. So I think,
Unless you're Donald Trump.
But I think to your point, Susan, I think to your point on the Donald Trump factor is if we look at what Craig was saying earlier today too, is that some of this stuff is absurd and crazy and media gets duped into covering it. And that's intentional. And I think in part the rise of Donald Trump is the media obsession with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, he brings in ratings.
It's like we
quite
can't
frankly.
stop looking.
Yeah, sir, hello.
Hi, my name is Shane Desick. I'm just wondering about the foreign interference angle of fake news or misinformation, or even, in that case, disinformation. Does it change how you deal with fake news if you can sort of guess that it's coming from a hostile government whose goal is to destabilize the democracy? And if so...
Do you mean how much we cover it, if we
No,
realize
I mean
that?
how you treat that kind of fake news. Is fake news just fake news? Or is the fact that the intent of that fake news is to really delegitimize the democratic process here in any liberal democracy, like Sweden, France, US?
Rod, why don't you try that one? Is it different when it's just some guy saying climate change isn't real versus Russia saying we're trying to stop this person from winning?
I mean, yes and no, because I like to have it all. I think we are still at a moment where we're figuring out just how much of that interference is, strictly speaking, foreign. And I'm not Glenn Greenwalding, no Russia, no interference here. What I'm saying is that we do not have a good way of measuring those things. There have been reports about the number of bots in a given election or on a given topic that we're stirring up. But I think sometimes we also forget that journalists live on Twitter and most humans don't. It's obviously that stuff filters through. I think it's very hard to judge in the moment. Like the idea of these libraries is that you can see that an ad that takes a position on a culture war issue, for example, is not coming from Russia or not coming from China. But I know how to use a VPN, and I assume that the Russian hackers do. There's levels of this stuff, and I think in the moment, it is going to be really hard to do that.
Yeah.
I think that is a conversation we will have 6 months out from the election when someone has had the time to go through and do all that work, a citizen lab or an academic institution.
Well, except CSEC, CSIS, PCO, there is a unit now that has been created to put their hand up and say, something bad is happening, stop.
But something bad is happening at such a high level.
Right, okay.
And so, ultimately, as people like to remind us particularly journalists on Twitter, we don't elect the prime minister, we elect individual MPs. If there's a disinformation campaign targeting a few MPs to swing things, I don't think we will. I don't think
Maybe
that's
not.
necessarily
Maybe not.
where CSIS puts its hand.
Yeah, okay. Yes.
Hi, I'm Susan Cora. I'm on the board of the Canadian Committee for World Press Freedom. You've been talking a lot about foreign interference in our upcoming election, and a few of you mentioned Russian bots. Are any of you concerned about, and I'm asking this because I've just been reading a book by Jonathan Manthorpe called The Claws of the Panda. Are you concerned about interference from the CPC, the Communist Party of China, in our election?
That's a rough one. We should be concerned. I was going to bring up China in response to the last question because we've seen that disinformation, geez, I'm even afraid to say this, is having an effect on lives of Canadians in China right now, lives of Canadian farmers, canola farmers. So some of this is very relevant, that it's not, I think the object of the interference, or the objective of the interference, is worth covering too, or worth paying attention to. You know, that there's mischief, you know, there's just rampant mischief. Maybe they just want to disrupt the election, or they're trying to get something done, right? So I think all journalists are concerned with every kind of disruption. I just think the aims of it would be different. That's not really an answer, I know.
No, but I think it's, I mean, we think we cite Russia because we know it's been done and we see them trying things already. Someone I was out with the other day said to me, Russia's not going to try and get a conservative government because they know that's not really going to help them. There was an advantage to trying to get Donald Trump, obviously. But what they might do is look at MPs who have been overly favorable or disfavorable to Russia. And, yes, and just target their particular elections in a riding. China might take that kind of approach too. If there is a particular topic or area or someone that has been particularly vocal, you could see how they might try and do things. It's just they have not, I don't think, done it with the same skill as Russia. Is that fair to say? That we know of. That we know of.
As overtly.
We just heard this week
Yeah.
that senior officials were telling the Star and BuzzFeed in this part of this project that foreign disruption has already started. There's been
Yes.
heightened cyber attacks are already going on. It's just, I don't know what the objective is yet.
Yeah. Hello.
Hi, I'm Carol Ann Horde, a former political assistant and current bureaucrat. Based on the current political climate, I think it's possible, and I'm wondering what you think, that the Prime Minister could call a summer election to take advantage of low voter turnout if things get worse for him. And if so, would you be ready for that? Because you're probably preparing now.
And then I'll stop. We've been asking about that.
Microphone.
We've been asking about that because, and Chantal Hébert actually wrote a column about that too. I take it that the new election law makes it very difficult to do that because there is a pre-writ period now and a writ period. And the pre-writ starts on June 30th. And all of this is in play. Technically, the Prime Minister can do whatever he wants, although unless Jody Wilson-Raybould doesn't want him to do it. But technically, the Prime Minister can do whatever he wants, but I do not think that he would bring that level of disruption to things. I think we have a law in place right now. And would he go against that law? There are too many things that work for the Liberals in that law for him to violate it. So no, I don't
They're
think so.
also not ready.
No.
Like very,
Just
very,
not ready.
yeah. They're just like frankly, they're not. They haven't moved to the war room. They don't have it all. They're not ready. But for us, we said we have to be ready by Easter. That was the goal of CBC, in case the shit hit the fan. Frankly, but I don't know. Are you guys? You're ready? Like ish.
I mean,
you'll always get ready.
Journalists respond to that's
Yeah.
what we do. So.
Yeah, we deploy. You know, you just cancel your summer holidays. That's all.
Shan Griffiths, freelance journalist. I was just wondering, to what extent do you think corruption could rear or should rear its head during the election? Right now we've got the political scandal, he said, she said, is Trudeau truly a feminist?
What do you mean by corruption? Because whether you're a feminist is not a corruption thing. What do you mean?
Allow me to finish.
Please.
So, were there inappropriate communications and so on? But behind all that, like an elephant, is SNC-Lavalin. And we haven't really heard too much about that. And just for example, Transparency International, which is the global anti-corruption watchdog, Canada's dropping down the listing. And I know with Ottawa locally, people are beginning to take an interest in, what's that organization again who's involved with the light railway? Oh, SNC-Lavalin. Was that all handled properly? And how did they get the So question, I heard that on CBC Ottawa Morning recently, so they're starting to take that dive. But should that take more of a should there be more of a spotlight on corruption? And it could be a really good opportunity to dig under corruption in Canada as well, because it's there, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's in the background right now, but it seems like an elephant, you know? It could
Yeah,
come
I mean,
to the
a reminder that there's a criminal trial with SNC at the heart of it, so it's not like they're just dancing around fancy-free. You know, something's going to happen there. But it's a good point that, because on Ottawa Morning, that's my best friend who hosts the show, so I listen to it. But there was a good connection between that, and you could start to see people saying, maybe we got screwed here.
It's interesting because coming from Montreal, where SNC-Lavalin and the corruption story played a huge part of the last few years of my career there, I was surprised coming to Ontario to see that it wasn't really part of the conversation. And I think it's important for people to remember that a lot of the things that are being discussed now are historical, you know, cases of alleged corruption and collusion that have been dealt with, to your point. So I think don't know what I did there. I do think, you know, these are things that are discussed, and I think bringing them out into the open are really important, but it is important to keep that context, that this is historical. These aren't new allegations. This isn't a new situation.
Right, and the company has changed pretty dramatically
Yeah,
since
and
that happened. Yeah.
And there were, like, you know, there are reports that people can go and look at from like 2012 to 2015 that outline what they've done in terms of their interactions with the government too. So it's I think the bigger context is worth looking into, but it has been out there as well.
Any thoughts from you, Mike, on that?
Well, I think, you know, a lot of the sort of coverage that we do is about how decisions are made in government and the influence that a company can have if it can afford to deploy a lot of lobbyists. So, you know, we've explored the range of these issues from, you know, in the past week looking at pesticides and the influence of the lobby there, what they're doing also to promote misinformation. I think there's a number of media outlets that we had outlined had given coverage to a documentary series that was actually produced by Edelman, which is now apparently trying to promote this trust thing.
Their trust meter.
So I think there's many different things that we can do a better job of as media outlets to look at how decisions are made. And I think when people are disillusioned with politics or with journalism, it is because we're not doing enough to open the curtain, show people what's going on behind the scenes. So, I mean, we're committed to doing that, and I think more of this type of coverage is needed, particularly in an election campaign. I think it's a good time for people to see these are the decisions the government made, this is how they were made, this is the evidence they actually reviewed before making those decisions, and this is the influence of the lobbyists.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the SNC story I think helped people understand, because I think it's something that people don't necessarily get, is access that companies like that can get to people in government. But that is not hidden access. It's not hard to go onto the registry and see every meeting that any person has had with anybody. Doesn't mean that you should all have to do that. We should do that and tell you why that's happening, and Mike does a lot of that kind of work. But if there's a good thing about this story, because I don't know what will be the outcome, it is that it gives a journalist a moment to say, oh yeah, we should be doing that more often, showing you that stuff that's happening, how the sausage is made a little bit, right? So that you know.
Labor-intensive though, you know, chasing up the paperwork and getting it legal.
Of course, yeah.
You know, sometimes the low-hanging fruit is easier to get after, but the work that needs, I'm just saying, we need to put in more, it's very labor-intensive.
Yeah, I mean, we all have big investigative units. Investigative units cost more than daily journalism, but I would say all of us are deeply committed to that. So, but you have to give people time for sure. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Gerling from Evidence for Democracy. So we've been talking about misinformation a lot in the context of, you know, external players and trolls and people sort of filtering in fake information online. But what about misinformation that's actually coming from politicians themselves? So we see, we see Trump a lot, lying, and then recently Doug Ford, talking about how a carbon tax is going to lead to a recession. So I'm curious as to how we approach misinformation that's actually coming from politicians, whether that's the media or the public. How do we approach that?
I can tackle that.
Go ahead. You probably all want it.
I think that we learned from the coverage in 2016 of Trump that if you just repeat what they say without actually making sure you're letting the reader or the audience know that what they're saying is false, that is not necessarily helpful. And I think you're seeing more and more from all media outlets that when politicians are making false statements, that there is a clear effort to underline, okay, they said this, here's what the fact is in the very next sentence, or even maybe it's in the headline, so-and-so falsely says, and I think that's one way of approaching it.
I think that for us, what we try to do, so we did a big data journalism project around Trans Mountain, and lots of different claims were coming in around how many communities have been consulted and who was saying what. And what we did for that project that maybe a lot of people wouldn't do was engage in the comments on Facebook. So instead of just saying like, oh, we're just gonna throw this out there, see what happens, we tried to say, hey, help us understand. So rather than just saying like, this is fake, I mean, that's not gonna change a Trump supporter's mind. And not that our goal is to change their mind, but our goal is to say, here's the information that we learned and here's how we learned it. So we were blocking, clear hate speech, but if someone was genuinely like, the chief signed on, why does it matter? Like, it should be a go. We were engaging in those conversations and trying to depolarize them at their root. And we actually found in this one situation that the conversations were a lot better that came out of that, and that people who you wouldn't expect to say like, oh, thank you for engaging in this, and not just saying you're stupid or you're an asshole, where are you coming from? Help me understand why you think this.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like what Fergus is doing.
Totally.
Yeah. And that changed the nature of the conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think it goes back to an earlier point that you made about asking tough questions and it being seen as political and partisan. And so I think that comes back to educating people about what our role is. Our role is not to be a stenographer. Our role is to challenge people on what they're saying and tease out the truth. And I think that, more and more we are getting blowback from politicians and other kind of leaders saying, well, you've challenged us on this. This means that you're aligned with the other guys. And I think that going back to educating people about, no, it's actually our role, and not just educating the public and our audience, but educating ourselves too, because it's easy to forget sometimes or to lose sight of that in the day-to-day, that we have an obligation. We have that access too, and we have an obligation to push back against claims and statements that aren't truthful.
What about, I'll let you answer, but let me frame it a little bit. What about, though, I've been getting a lot of people saying, well, why, Andrew Scheer tweeted this, why don't you correct him? And I think to myself, but I can't do that all day long. Like, I can't do that with him or Justin Trudeau. Like, I can't do that all day. Daniel Dale sort of does that all day. But I don't know, I also have to find stories and talk to people. And so so how much of it, like I think you talked about choosing your moments to fact check something. When do you call someone a liar? Like how do we choose our spots? Put that to both of you.
I mean, I'll tell a story quickly, hopefully.
Yeah.
A few months ago, when our biggest geopolitical crisis was Saudi Arabia, not China.
And not SNC.
Well, I mean, the Liberal MP Omar Al-Ghabra was on Foreign Politics, I believe. And Senator Denise Batters tweeted about this fact.
Yes.
Mr. Al-Ghabra did not, as Senator Batters said, was not, as she said, born in Saudi Arabia. He spent part of his childhood there. And she linked these two things and said, isn't it interesting that he's the one answering questions on here? I'm not going to go down that path because
it was pretty scandalous, though.
But what happened in the wake of that is that a Conservative MP, who I cannot remember the name of, which is good because I probably have gotten it wrong and that wouldn't be great, replied to that tweet with a blog post that claimed that Mr. Al-Ghabra was an Islamist plant, an Islamist sleeper agent, who the Liberal Party had elected to carry out, and you can see where this is going. Understandably, at least one person on Twitter was like, what the hell? And he took it down, and his response was, well, I didn't know whether this was true or not, and I didn't know what the source was, so I just posted it.
An MP did that.
An MP.
Yeah.
Mr. Scheer's office still hasn't answered my questions about that. That was at least 8 months ago. I've since moved media outlets. If they ever reply, I will not get the email. So if they're watching, I will... I'll email you again about it. I bring this up to say the threshold for that, and like, it seems like a silly thing to chase because it's so obviously ludicrous. But like, there you have one unelected official, but a political person with a stature, and an elected official spinning an elaborate theory about another elected official. I could spend all day chasing those things. And in that case, I chose to because it was just so absurd. But like, yeah, I do think that we can't, if we end up playing, to use a gendered term, unfortunately, nanny to these politicians when they're like going off on all these things, we risk looking partisan, but also we have no time to do anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I'm not actually saying anything that everybody else here hasn't said. We have to pick our spots because otherwise this is just exhausting, and the campaign's going to be exhausting already. So like,
Susan, what do you think?
The only thing I would add is one depressing footnote to this is about the tribalization of truth, right? That we've all seen the studies, is that truth now is, often people define their truth by what team they're on or what tribe they're coming from. And no amount of talking to them will make them see that as truth. And, I like the idea of engaging with the commenters, even though it makes me physically ill. I did it this week. Some guy wrote to me, and normally I just let them go by. I have a rule. I actually put this up on Twitter this week. I have a rule that if you write me a letter and you call a politician a nickname, I will not respond to you. And I will throw your letter in the garbage bin. And it is a remarkably good filter for getting rid of nonsense. But this guy did the lying liberal newspaper, blah, blah, blah. And so I just said to him, here's what our day was today. Here's what the Toronto Star's Ottawa Bureau did. And I gave him sort of the list of everything we did. And he sent me back a note. I apologize for my rude insults, and I won't do it again. And I thought, okay, maybe there's something to this. So it may be that, speak truth to trolls.
Your next book title.
We've got like 2 new books for her. She's going to be very upset with us. I see 2 gentlemen. We'll probably have time for one more question. So if you're desperate, now's the time to get in line, because then I'm going to cut you off. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, I'm Angelo Baculas. I'm a recent graduate of the MA in Political Science here at Carleton. My question is, fake news seems to be so appealing because it's so snappy and so attractive, because it's often a lie. Do you think that competing with fake news discounts the ability of mainstream media making quality reporting and in-depth quality reporting? Do you think there's a way to introduce what I remember as a child on like mainstream TV, like in-depth, like 10, 15-minute reporting on one issue into online news and into this new world we're living in?
I would just say I think it's done exactly that, fake news. I actually think it's had somewhat the opposite effect. While it's been harder to do all the things that we're talking about, I think it's also caused newsrooms to spend more money and more time doing things in depth. You just have to look at the subscriptions for the New York Times and the Washington Post to know that the effect of someone calling them fake news has had the opposite effect. And certainly in our, also think in the changing news environment, where you're trying to find ways to get to people who may not want to watch or read your papers or whatever, the way to do that is to either break news stories that are real or do in-depth investigative work. And I'm sure, Michelle, that's where a focus is for you as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, just like in responding to people, we pick and choose our spots. And so we invest in things that we think are really important, and we will invest the time and resources to do them properly. And it takes a lot of time to do an investigative piece, but we'll do it, and we'll do it to the point where we're happy. And somebody earlier was talking about the analytics, and I look at the analytics constantly, all day, every day, and it heartens me to see that the pieces that we've invested a lot of time and passion into, that's reflected in how people consume it, and we will have deep engagement and time spent with those pieces. So
Can you give us an example of one that has been
Yep,
done surprisingly well, maybe?
just, the longer a piece generally is online, the less people tend to engage with it, just because, people want quick and snappy reads. But recently, after the bus crash, one of our reporters, Andrew Duffy, spent, basically 2 months reconstructing a minute-by-minute account of what had happened in the moments leading up to the crash and after the crash. And, that took a lot of time, and it was his full-time job for a while, and, it took a lot of resources from elsewhere in the newsroom. And people, for close to a week after, it was our top performing story through all the other breaking news that was going on that cycle. And it was something that people were spending, 10, 15 minutes with. That's really deep.
Yeah.
And so I think it is validation for that investment, but it is something we can't do on everything that we want to. We have to really pick and choose our spots of where we're going to do this.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I would just say, I look at the data obsessively too, and I was telling Rosie this earlier. I'm really heartened by what I see too. People really love explanatory journalism. They really like it, and they'll spend the time with it. So the reward is there. It's, sometimes you think, I'm going to look at that data page and all I'm going to see is horoscopes and cat videos, right? But people really do want to read about, and things like carbon tax, they want to read about. So, there's encouragement there.
Also, the stories sometimes that you think, oh, well, that's not relatable, are not those stories, and that's why that information is important. The China story, for instance, I'm sure it did well for everybody. That was off the charts, the number of people that would want to read those stories on our website and pay attention to that story, and it was 2 Canadians in a jail in China and a woman, and so complicated. And for some reason, they wanted they wanted that explained to them, and they wanted to understand. So, thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Barry Wilson, and I just have a question. It's been alluded to in a couple of answers, but my question really is, as media, so-called mainstream media, plan for election coverage, is there factored into that any sort of strategy on how to defend your credibility or defend your usefulness in the system? I've for more than 4 decades or 40 years, I consumed media as a member of the tribe. And now I have the luxury of consuming media as a citizen. When I see newspapers or broadcast media try to explain what they do and why they do it, it always comes across to me now as kind of self-serving and a little bit defensive. And I wonder if part of the strategy for covering the election is to deal with that issue of, we have lots of competitors, why should you read or listen to us?
I've seen that too, Barry, and nice to see you again. I've seen it too. Our editor-in-chief spends a lot of time on Twitter explaining why we're doing what we're doing, and I think some of that is to assure people. I see what you mean by self-interested, but we should also face facts, right? We need people to pay for news. That's what you're seeing, and there may be a market thing behind that, but we do need people to pay for news. There's been, if our business wants to exist, we are 2 things. We are a public service, and we are also a business. And I think you're seeing it's not cynical but it's facts. We are arguing for ourselves so that people will get a subscription and read us, so that we can continue to do what we do.
And the best way, I'm sure you agree, the best way for, obviously I'm a public broadcaster, so it's a little different, but the best way, I think, for private journalism enterprises to sell themselves is to deliver good product, right? And then convince people to pay for it. And I have been heartened that is happening more. You might not get it at your doorstep, but you're paying for it somewhere.
And right? I think that perhaps the one thing that journalists, when you say that it seems a bit disingenuous or self-serving or something. I think that as the industry has been cut, 290 outlets are closed in over 190, over 260 outlets closed in 190 communities across Canada in the last decade. I think that what you see, though, is then people are trying to say journalism matters, and we've seen a little bit of a shift, to your point, to say, let's do the deep work to show. Like, just saying journalism matters, journalism is important, like, I don't know, unless it actually affects people's lives in their core, you're not gonna get that transfer. So I think you've seen that shift, and that the rise of audience-funded journalism is really causing some of that shift into deeper work. Because if it's not just about clicks, and if it's not just about serving advertisers, and we really know that we're monetizing the public, then we have to serve people with deeper content.
It is a result. Just the model that's changed is advertisers are no longer financing journalism that readers are. So we have to have a more direct conversation with readers.
Yeah.
Can I just get a final thought from all of you, 15 seconds, about the one thing that you are going to keep in mind as we get closer to this and you continue to do all of the important work that you're doing in the various different ways? The one thing you're going to keep in mind as we head towards the election, Michelle?
That's a really good, tough
I
question.
know. I'm a journalist.
It shows. I think kind of engaging in more of a dialogue, and to your point about responding to commenters, it is daunting, but I do think being really listening to what's being said about us during the campaign, but also just really understanding what people's concerns are, and I think really trying to avoid being condescending and explaining fact versus fiction, and
that's a good one.
What I'm hoping for.
Lindsay?
Yeah, I agree with that point. I think that what I'm left thinking about really is just where are we left after the election? So, we're all so focused on the election, but what is it going to mean next? And so I think the most important thing is, like you said, just genuinely listening to people and engaging with the issues that people really care about and want to understand more.
Mike?
I think National Observer, we have come to realize our readers appreciate in-depth coverage that is informative, that has all the details, that they have such a huge appetite for that it's what I hope that we can continue to do. And at the same time, as everyone else here has said, it's important for us to continue to have a dialogue and listen to what our readers are saying as we produce these pieces, and listen to their advice and make sure it is a symbiotic, two-way relationship.
Susan?
Yeah, mine would be resist inertia. I think that there's too much of this idea that what worked before as election coverage is going to work again. And we saw in the last campaign, it was a long one, but we saw that many things can change and many unexpected things can happen, and don't assume that the way we covered elections before is the way we should cover elections in the future.
How about you?
For those keeping score, I've said mean things about both the Liberals and the Conservatives.
What about the NDP?
What I'd say is what we're going to do, and because this is just the way our outlet is set up, is focus on policy. Politics is incredibly important. You live in Ottawa, but policy is what happens after the election. And the platforms are going to matter, and we should cover them, and that's somewhere where we feel we can be effective. So that's what we're going to do, and I'm going to look forward to reading everybody else on the politics, because I am as much into that as anybody else.
Okay. I hope this has been helpful, informative.
Hey, what about you?
Oh, what was the question again? What's the thing I'll be thinking about? I'll just be thinking, as the public broadcaster, everyone feels this way, but because you're paying for me, I feel it even weightier, maybe, just how I can make sure that I'm serving you well, and listening to you, and making sure voters are equipped to make the good decisions. Everyone's doing that. Yeah, I feel like if I don't do it, I'm really going to hear about it from you. So that's what I'll be trying to remember and be really thankful it's not 11 weeks because that almost killed me. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you all for coming. I know Sean's going to come up and talk a bit more, but thank all of you. That was really great perspective. Thank you.